So I'd like to talk a little bit about this course correction postulation. It's not a mere postulation or a proposition, but rather an ever-consuming ontology that is quite maddening, because you only have these placeholdings based on anti-principle, or the way that the world seems to operate in truth. So, in other words, true ontology, pure truth, doesn't require course correction. And what I'm proposing, it's really, the articulation is Burckhardt-Heim's essentially a six-principle based structural and teleological model that deals with breadth and height and gets into all the presuppositions of what reality is based on. And when we structuralize this into an actual working model, we see that the sphere itself, and even more so if you look at non-Euclidean spherical mathematics, there's an abstraction here that might start to drive a lot of people crazy, because they're looking on one side here as phenomenology, and even further as noumenon, right? Or when we look at Welt or Welt, Welt, Weltbild, Weltanschauung, Weltanschauung, Krieg, a lot of these fancy German words that really are dealing with the world from a parallax view and perspective, but also from a multifarious, well, you see, this isn't what's implied. In other words, what's implied are many different visual models, vantage points, but to get into the ideology or the individuation or the very Gnostic singularity as a perspective, in other words, all perspectives lead to one perspective and one main proponent or entity, or I mean, I hate to jump to this, but it starts to look a lot more like a Abraxas, right? So you start to see this emergence of what we would esteem as both a god and a devil, because we can't see that the main constituents of need are that we're being short-sighted in the fact that our needs have become the hailing factor in our decisions as living biological hosts that think that they're held under a zoomed-out Mendelbrot perspective of this is the way I really think, right? So this is, in other words, this is all presupposed. You're not only given the framework, structural components, back to Heim's theorization, which I propose that, and I know that Heim played with this a little bit too, Burckhardt-Heim, but where we have a course correction built into the procedural process, but then an inevitable, through the course correction, we now have to get into the fact is, does new information then need to be written or overwritten into the field, right, as a response? Is this a reset, as the WEF and many other, the great work and all this other bullshit, higher order type of franchisable, sellable memes that further distract and pull away from the true depth and the complexity of what we're discussing? In other words, we're given the tools to practice and exercise the lesser notion of being and becoming. But when we aspire, when we fly too high, when we grasp too much, too great, the ontology itself, you'll get bit by the insect, the spider riding on the electromagnetic waves flying, really. When you step into its web, that is the irremovable prospect or the aspect that this is the corner, this is the dark corner where spiders go. Therefore, this is where you walk. Whether or not you kill the spider, that's determinate and detrimental to your own moral agenda. Some might see this as a dharma, a karma, or a return of virtue or morality, right? In the sense of, should I kill the spider? Is the spider a threat to me? Should I study the spider? Right? We think that there's a limitless number of ideas when we come into contact with another entity, and what we're really trying to do is absorb a provability that this entity actually lives and is attempting to exist within my field or my frame of view, right? In other words, we're capitalistic gods that are allowed to pretend we're gods, but we are not allowed to acknowledge that we are, in fact, an aspect of this. So even Heidegger gives us design, right? He gives us, or design, right? He gives us the Dasein, or the idea of this humanitarian amalgamation of really a mother Earth, right? He doesn't want to presuppose that this is Mother Earth, but actually in a discourse and from the lineage of where he's coming from, he's backing slightly away from the master supremacy, right? He's not giving you the religion, but he's leaving space open. Whereas Nietzsche really says, look, you want to see who comes closest to this Messiah figure? Like, really, with the proof and everything? Well, we have Zarathustra, we have the Zoroaster. We have someone who actually lived and was documented and recorded and celebrated and written about in factual nature, to where even if this was an ideation, an ideology, like Marcus Aurelius' Lamentations, his meditations, of writing down the man that he could be and he would be, and therefore making it factual, where he realized, much like getting into Burckhardt-Heim's theory, because when you take time into the equation, you could presuppose this. What if I spent an equal or greater amount of time as I do being the tyrant ruler, right? And this gets into the Hellfire Club, right? Benjamin Franklin, really what these assholes were playing with, and thought, oh, this is the holy sepulchre, right? We're going to come up with all these different names. We're going to wear mushrooms on our heads. We're going to create all these divisions. We're going to call it the Illuminati, then erase it, then replace it. But we're just following the same fucked up artwork and the same higher tier system of a militia. That if you don't accept it, if you don't accept the proposal of our ontology, then we're going to kill you, right? Or we'll make a jackass out of you, and then celebrate that too. Give us a reason, a cause to celebrate. But to really get into the concept or the action, that what we're dealing with on a time interface is, if I spend as much time being the tyrant as I do fantasizing about being this selfless Messiah figure, how real can I make that? How many more colors and shades? In fact, if I go about what I know is the ontology, because I have, through my lineage, I have disproved, right, to myself anyway, as a sort of NPC player, right? I was rejected because I did not have the pure principle way about me, and therefore I looked at myself and I looked at my brothers and I said, we are all from the line of Cain, right? We enjoy killing animals and eating them. We enjoy the war. We enjoy the conquest, the sexual aspects of conquest. We don't look at or need to look at. So it's the first sort of toxic masculinity that we're re-exposed to with the reinvention of the new man, right? I do believe that Jason Reza Torjani believes this, but that he knows that he's being very Iran-centric in the fact that he believes, and maybe he's right, who knows, that is in fact the original seat or seed of this reinvention of man, and that I believe that he believes, having read a lot of his research, watched a lot of his interviews over the years, that, and I'm not saying he's right or wrong, that this transhumanism was in fact first attempted or re-attempted from an origin story when we get into the Garden of Eden, but really, which really could be looked at as modern or ancient Babylon, what we think is ancient now, but really is a modern transition or transgression of Babylon. In other words, you didn't just have the Kabbalah and the poor Jews that were probably trying to live a pure sort of way and squabbling with themselves, right? And ended up being exposed to those who just sort of, the end justifies the means, do what thou wilt will be the whole of the law, where Crowley was picking up on a past transmission of just do what the fuck you want to do, put it into this sort of ontological, teleological order, in other words, ritualization. It seems so complex, but all you're really doing is you're looking at what you would do when you go about making a sandwich, right? But let's presuppose that the microwave didn't exist, that the refrigerator wasn't there, and to make a sandwich in the most rudimentary, crude way required certain offerings from different dialectical undertones or different geographical placings throughout time and history that more than implied a cultivation. Do I put olive oil on it? How's the olive oil rendered? What type of bread am I using? Is it flat bread? Is it risen bread? Right? So not only this, but the dialectical patterns all became part of an LLM or a large language model, right? A large language model in reference to the small ideation of what that localized ontology meant to the so-called individual. But I would even further say that accents, enunciation, and how certain dialectical tones, such as the British, right, that stood their occupation, right, talking in the way that they do, speaking in the dialectical tone that they do, that implies a reincarnation back to the same geographical landscape, and that as far as punitive damages to the ontology go, infractions, that people might be cast out of their land and placed into another place. Theoreticians that are based around this practical magic, and let's just call it magic, because in other words, what we're doing is we're going about the same ritual, the same protocol, but we understand as the sort of occulted mechanism that going about the practice through the systemization of really what are we looking at? 5 points, 6 points, 7 points, 8 points, 9 points, 10 points for the return, 11, death, 12, a higher level of completion. But then when you get into the Fibonacci sequence, the Phi or Phi formulation, the golden mean, you start to see how numbers act different. They react different. They have a geometria and a numerology that supersedes and hails back to a perfected and purified place or stance and follows its own number patterns, right? And when you start to create this diagram where you put this on running what I call pi mathematics, which is just our basic number count 1 through 9, right? And how we multiply this and add zeros at that point. But really getting into the Phoenician, Babylonian zero and starting to take a closer look at this and going, wait a minute, where the advent of this took place is prior to this, from kind of a Gnostic, Coptic Gnostic perspective, they understood what John Dee was implying when he was speaking of and referencing this monad, that within this mystic almond, Prince Rupert's drop, mind I say, tear-shaped measure, you could invariably have the sphere in a sense of if I look at the dewdrop as it's actively falling through space, and I were to look up at it, I would see nothing but the head of a perfect sphere. But I would also see a dot in the center if I look really close, and that is the end of its tail. And if I got on the other end and I'm looking at this singular water drop as it's dripping down, and I look down, it's giving me a very similar manifestation, right? Where I have this conical view. Is it going away from me or is it going toward me? Even more so, it's implying gravity. It's saying, is gravity real? Does a singular spherical drop fall? So in other words, if I take gravity out of the situation, animation begins to mean something different morphologically, right? If that makes sense to you. From a structural component, going back to Burkhard Heim's instituting, right? Going all the way up through the structure and the teleology, and breaking away from like a singular unit, the non-Euclidean spherical mathematics, or you get into Leibniz structuralization of convex, concave, mixed in with non-Euclidean spherical mathematics, and then the implied, what really I think John Dee was heavily leaning upon, which is the Metatron's cube, where you're beginning to see all shapes, all forms taking place, and that man, in his thought process, is capable of transmuting or putting into active motion through imagination, which isn't just some fantasy land, right? So we get back into Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, where that's not really who he was. We know that he produced an ill-conceived offspring, Commodus. We know that his wife was nothing but young Faustina, a complete hoe, a slut. And there's even, stories that circulate around about him bathing in one of her lovers in their blood, one of his main high-level soldiers, I think a general, that he actually killed off because all she did is just philander about, right? So you look at this person whose life was a wreck, and then you start to think, was he in fact a victim, or was he a completely different person? And in his writings, in his meditations, he became the personification of this alter ego, which, as Napoleon, paraphrasing, is basically history is what whoever is alive to write it and say it, lie about it, contend that this is really what happened. That becomes the history, the narrative of what we believe in, right? So I think that this has been known for quite some time, and I also think that the ability to interfere with and to rewrite the ontology itself became something that of a religious or ritual practice, where as long as certain parameters were respected, that is the pecking order of, are you going to begin with a pure state of being? What does that look like? It says more about you than the actual state of being, but it's compared to the higher tier of being and becoming. But then you get into the phasic properties of the aspects of, okay, this is one degree, this is one tear drop, this is one submission away from the pure center, and this is the direction it goes in. Now, what's the next direction it goes in, right? And the next, and the next, and the next, and that you could presuppose, just like Plutchik's wheel or Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You could start out with a pyramidal structure, but then all you're doing when you deviate away from looking at this as if it's a monad, not necessarily the hieroglyphic monad by John Dee, but the monad is a singular unit that encompasses and comprises all ontological things, and even does not require any course correction. So this is the original. In other words, begin to think, what if we went to the back side of this Metatron's cube and saw in this a sort of inverted pentagram, a pentacle, right, with those rings around it, where it's locked in, it's presupposing itself, it's saying, no, I'm complete as well. I'm antithetical to the face or the pure aspect of this ontology. What happens when we do this? And that's where we're at. We are in the throngs of Babylon. We're in the new Babylon. Really, if you really want to look at it, even though Atlantis was said to have taken place, I mean, it's subjective, right? If you want to get into the discourse throughout time and history of what the true origins of Atlantis are, it's so subjective, right? But I think it's safer to follow something like what Jason Reza-Georgiani has done, where he's looking at the evolution that became Prometheus, right? When you're beginning to look at this, you're really taking on that torch, and you're saying, even further, do I pass the torch on in a sort of decathlon, or do I snuff the torch out, seeing that this is just going to lead toward more folly, or do I watch with fascination and then suddenly realize that from the vantage point that I'm staring and I'm witnessing this as an observer, I realize myself as not an observer, but somebody within the room that is supposed to now everyone's looking at you and going, aren't you going to move? You only have so much time, right? And to say that you are an aspect toward the becoming of this transhumanistic event